I always believed life was built like one of my skyscrapers. Strong foundations, carefully constructed layers, and every piece fitting just where it needed to. You work hard, you stay consistent, and you trust the structure to hold. For the past 20 years, my marriage to Lillian had felt like that. Not perfect, but solid. Dependable. Something I could count on. Until the night I found the letter. It was late, maybe 9 or so, and Lillian had gone to one of her yoga classes. I had my scotch in hand, savoring the quiet. Work had been brutal lately, dealing with permits, contractors, and clients who wanted the world for half the cost. I remember opening the desk drawer, looking for a pen, when I saw it. A crumpled piece of paper shoved carelessly under some receipts. I almost left it alone. Lillian wasn't the type to leave anything interesting lying around. But something made me pick it up, smooth it out, and start reading. Dearest Jason. It took me a second to process the name. Jason. Not a brother, not a cousin, not someone I knew. And then I read the rest. You make me feel alive. Tired of living in the shadow of someone else's ambition. Can't wait to be in your arms. By the time I finished, my scotch was warm, untouched. I sat there, staring at her elegant handwriting. The same graceful curve she used to write me notes when we were young. Only this time, every word cut like a knife. Jason, a younger man, a lover. I folded the letter and put it back exactly as I'd found it. My hands were shaking. That surprised me. I faced down more than my share of crises, economic downturns, lawsuits, even losing my father's company and rebuilding it from scratch. But this felt different, personal, like someone had taken a crowbar to the foundation of my life and left it wobbling. I didn't confront her. Not that night. Not the next morning either. I knew better. Lillian was a smart woman. If I came at her with accusations, she'd either deny it or turn the whole thing around, painting herself as the victim. And frankly, I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. Instead, I watched. That's what I do. I watch, I learn, and then I act. For the next few days, I paid attention to every little detail. The way she smiled when her phone buzzed. How she took longer to get ready when she said she was meeting friends. The subtle way she kept her handbag within arm's reach, as if it held secrets she couldn't risk me finding. By Thursday, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. When she told me she had plans with her girlfriends, I kissed her on the cheek, wished her a good time, and followed her out of the driveway. She led me across town to a boutique hotel. Not exactly subtle. I parked a block away and waited, watching as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement. She looked radiant, I'll give her that. The way she always did when she felt desired. And there he was, waiting at the entrance. Jason. He looked exactly how I'd imagined him. Younger, confident in that cocky way that only comes from inexperience. He wasn't handsome. Not really, but he had an air about him that screamed, look at me. They disappeared inside together, leaving me alone in the car with my thoughts. I could have walked in, caused a scene, but I didn't. That's not my style. I've built skyscrapers from rubble, clawed my way to the top of an industry that eats weaker men alive. I didn't get here by acting on impulse. I sat there for 2 hours, imagining what was happening inside. It was torture, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about my pride, my name, everything I'd built. Jason had no idea what he'd stepped into, but he was about to find out. By the time I got home that night, the anger had burned off, leaving something colder in its place. I didn't want to confront Lillian. I wanted to outmaneuver her. I wanted to make Jason regret the day he ever touched what was mine. I spent the next morning digging into Jason's life. Social media made it easy. Real estate agent, mid-level success, flashy cars, and overpriced watches. He looked like a man trying to prove something to himself, to the world. I've seen his type before. Men who think they're clever, but are too blinded by their own arrogance to see the trap closing around them. The trap in this case was a business deal. I set up a meeting through a dummy corporation, a development project that would seem too good to pass up. Jason would walk into it, thinking he was about to strike gold, and when the time was right, I'd pull the rug out from under him. Meanwhile, I turned my attention back to Lillian. If she thought I was too busy to notice her lies, I'd prove her wrong. Flowers, dinners, compliments. I played the part of the doting husband, And to my surprise, she leaned into it. For a moment, I wondered if she felt guilty, if she looked at me and saw the man she'd married all those years ago. But then I'd think about that letter, and all I felt was the weight of her betrayal. That night, I lay awake beside her, listening to her soft, even breaths. She looked peaceful, like a woman with no regrets. Meanwhile, my mind raced, piecing together the next steps. Jason thought he'd won her heart. Lillian thought she'd fooled me. The morning after my silent vigil by the hotel, I woke up before Lillian. The house was quiet, the air thick with that strange calm that comes before a storm. She stirred beside me, her breathing deep and untroubled, as if she didn't have a care in the world. That was the part that gnawed at me. I built my life, our life, on hard work and sacrifice. And here she was treating it all like a disposable convenience. As I poured my coffee, I thought about Jason. I could almost see his smug grin as he strutted through his day, likely basking in the idea of winning something that wasn't his to take. Men like him didn't scare me. I'd dealt with their kind before, overconfident, underqualified, always chasing the next shiny thing. They were easy to manipulate because they thought they were in control. By the time the coffee pot was empty, I had the beginnings of a plan. Jason's career as a real estate agent offered the perfect opening. People like him were always looking for the deal that would catapult them into the big leagues, and I was about to hand him one wrapped in gold-plated lies. The first step was to understand my competition. I dug deeper into Jason's world, starting with the public breadcrumbs he'd carelessly left online. A few clicks revealed everything I needed to know. He worked for a boutique real estate firm, one of those places where the office was all marble and glass, but the staff was drowning in debt. Jason's posts were a masterclass in insecurity. Luxury cars, expensive dinners, and self-congratulatory quotes about the grind. He was over-leveraged, desperate to climb higher, and utterly predictable. That's when I contacted Frank. Frank was an old friend, someone I trusted completely. He'd helped me set up dummy corporations before for deals where discretion was key. With his help, I created a shell company, a fake investor group with just enough legitimacy to pique Jason's interest. It wasn't difficult to arrange a casual introduction through a mutual acquaintance in the real estate world. Within days, Jason would believe he'd stumbled upon the opportunity of a lifetime. At home, I kept up appearances. If Lillian suspected I knew about her affair, she didn't show it. In fact, she seemed more relaxed than she had in months, as if her little secret had lifted some invisible weight. That alone was enough to make my blood boil, but I swallowed the anger and played my part. I bought her flowers one afternoon, bright yellow tulips, the kind she used to love. Her eyes lit up when she saw them. But there was hesitation too, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt. Good. Let her feel that. Let her wonder what I was thinking, whether I'd noticed the way she glanced at her phone every time it buzzed. We went out to dinner that week, just the two of us. I picked her favorite restaurant, ordered her favorite wine, and listened attentively as she talked about mundane things. Her book club, a new Pilates class, a charity gala she wanted to attend. She looked happy, almost radiant. It would have been easy to forget, for a moment, that she'd betrayed me. But I didn't forget. Every smile she gave me, every laugh, felt like a performance, and I filed it all away, another piece of evidence in the growing case against her. By Friday, the bait was ready. Jason received a phone call from one of my investors, a man named Paul, who was as fictional as the shell company he represented. Paul pitched the deal as casually as possible, an exclusive opportunity to invest in a luxury condo development that hadn't been announced yet. The details were vague enough to sound plausible, but enticing enough to hook a man like Jason. And hook him it did. Within an hour, Jason had agreed to a meeting. That's the thing about people who chase quick wins. They never stop to ask why the opportunity landed in their lap. They're too busy imagining the payoff. Lillian, meanwhile, continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She left for her yoga classes, her book clubs, and the occasional girls' night that I knew was anything but. I let her go. If she was going to lie, I wasn't going to stop her. Not yet. But I did start to wonder just how much of her life with me was real. Was it all a performance? Had it been for years? There was one moment that gave me pause. It was late one night, and I was in my office reviewing some contracts when she came in, barefoot and wrapped in a silk robe. She leaned against the doorframe, looking at me like she used to in the early days of our marriage. "You work too hard," she said softly, her voice almost tender. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched her, trying to see through her words, her expression. Was she feeling guilty? Trying to distract me? Or was this some new layer of the game she was playing? I wanted to ask her outright, to throw her letter at her feet and demand an explanation. But I didn't. Not yet. By the end of the week, the pieces were in place. Jason was fully invested in the fake deal, and Lillian seemed blissfully unaware of my growing suspicions. I felt like a man watching a chessboard, every move deliberate, every piece exactly where it needed to be. The next step would be critical. If Jason thought the deal was going to make him rich, he'd soon realize the cost of underestimating me. And Lillian? Well, she'd find out soon enough that I wasn't the kind of man who let betrayal go unanswered. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Jason didn't know it yet, but I was already 10 steps ahead of him. Lillian didn't know it either. And when the moment came, when the truth finally unraveled, they'd both see exactly who they were dealing with. I've always believed that timing is everything. In business, in construction, in life. Lay the foundation too soon, and it won't set properly. Act too late, and you miss the window of opportunity. Watching Jason dive headfirst into my trap felt like watching a novice bricklayer trying to build a wall without mortar. He had no idea how badly this would collapse. The initial meeting between Jason and my investor, Paul, went exactly as I'd planned. Jason was eager, wide-eyed, and practically drooling over the possibility of a partnership with a supposed luxury developer. Paul dangled just enough details to keep him intrigued while staying vague enough to avoid scrutiny. By the end of the conversation, Jason was hooked. He left the meeting with the belief that he was about to make his first major leap into real estate development. Meanwhile, I kept my distance, watching from the shadows. It was almost laughable how quickly he took the bait, how little he questioned the authenticity of the opportunity. But that was Jason's weakness, his need to prove himself. And I was more than happy to exploit it. At home, things were complicated. Lillian seemed lighter, more at ease than she'd been in months. It was as if she thought her little secret had given her a new lease on life. I let her believe it. The truth was, I'd started to enjoy playing the part of the oblivious husband. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that every step she took brought her closer to the moment I'd reveal my hand. One night, as we sat on the patio sipping wine, she leaned back in her chair and smiled at me. One of those soft, intimate smiles she used to give me when we were younger. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "More attentive." I met her gaze and smiled back. "Maybe I've been reminded of what's important." She tilted her head, studying me, and for a moment, I wondered if she suspected something. But then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her touch lingering just a little too long. "I like it," she said. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I leaned forward and kissed her knuckles, playing the role she wanted me to play. If she thought she could fool me, I'd let her believe it for now. By the middle of the week, I decided it was time to see just how far Lillian was willing to go. I had a meeting scheduled downtown, and I deliberately left my briefcase at home. Inside were a few innocuous documents, nothing of real value, but enough to look important. When I returned later that evening, the briefcase was exactly where I'd left it, except for one thing. The latch was slightly ajar. I opened it and found the papers inside shuffled, not in the neat order I always kept them. Lillian had been snooping. I leaned against my desk, staring at the disheveled contents of the briefcase, and felt a flicker of dark amusement. So, she was in deeper than I'd thought. Was it guilt that drove her to look through my things? Fear? Or was Jason involved, pushing her to gather information for him? Either way, it didn't matter. All it told me was that they were growing bolder, and that would be their undoing. The turning point came the following Friday. Jason called Paul, brimming with excitement. He'd secured a private investor willing to front a substantial sum for the fake development deal. It was a classic rookie move, dragging another party into a scheme he didn't fully understand. That investor, of course, was another one of my creations, a second layer of the trap. Jason was walking into a web, and he was bringing others along with him. But it wasn't enough to simply ruin Jason financially. I needed to expose him and Lillian for what they were. I wanted the world to see their betrayal, to feel the weight of their shame. And so, I began planning the next phase, a confrontation that would leave no doubt about who held the upper hand. At home, I kept the charade going. Lillian, oblivious to my growing knowledge, seemed to bask in the illusion of our rekindled romance. I surprised her with tickets to a play she'd mentioned months ago, took her out for late-night drives along the coast, and even started leaving her little notes around the house. Simple messages like "thinking of you" or "can't wait to see you tonight." Each time, she'd smile as if she'd won some unspoken game, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Unease, perhaps, or guilt. It didn't matter. What mattered was keeping her off balance, making her believe that I was completely blind to her betrayal. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. "You've been so sweet lately," she said, her voice soft. "It's almost like the old days." I looked at her reflection and smiled. Maybe I've just realized how lucky I am. Her hand faltered for a fraction of a second, the brush pausing mid-stroke. Then she smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I turned away before she could see the smirk I couldn't suppress. By the end of the week, everything was in place. Jason was fully committed to the fake deal, his investors' money already transferred into an account I controlled. Lillian, meanwhile, seemed content to live in her bubble of deception, unaware that I was quietly dismantling the life she thought she'd built. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were all moving exactly as I'd planned, each step bringing me closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. Soon, Jason and Lillian would realize the full extent of their mistake. The moment I'd been waiting for came sooner than expected. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Lillian made her move, or rather, Jason made his through her. It started with a casual question over breakfast. "Do you still keep those old project files in your office?" she asked, stirring her coffee like it was any other day. I glanced at her over the rim of my mug, keeping my expression neutral. "Which ones?" "Oh, the big ones from a few years ago. I was thinking about that hotel project you worked on downtown. It just popped into my head." Her voice was light, casual, but I wasn't fooled. She never asked about my work unless she had a reason. I shrugged, setting my mug down. "Most of them are in storage, but I keep a few key ones here." "Why?" She smiled a little too quickly. "No reason. I was just curious." Curious. That was the word she always used when she wanted to deflect. I didn't press her. Instead, I let her think she'd planted the seed unnoticed. By the time she left for her yoga class, I already knew what would happen next. That night, after Lillian had gone to bed, I reviewed the footage from the security cameras I'd installed in my office a week earlier. I kept it quiet, hiding the setup in plain sight where she'd never think to look. Sure enough, there she was, rifling through my desk drawers, her movements quick but deliberate. She wasn't just snooping, she was searching for something specific. I leaned back in my chair, watching as she paused to glance over her shoulder before pulling out a file labeled Westminster Project. It was a decoy, of course, filled with outdated blueprints and benign details. But the look on her face, satisfaction mixed with tension, was priceless. So, Jason had convinced her to steal from me. I'd wondered how far she'd go to protect him, to prove her loyalty. Now I had my answer. The next day, Jason walked into the trap I'd set. He showed up at the investor's office with the stolen documents, confident that he now had leverage to solidify the fake deal. He probably thought he was being clever, that the old files would give him an edge in negotiations. Instead, they gave me exactly what I needed to expose him. I watched the exchange unfold from a hidden feed, the camera capturing every smirk, every boast. Jason handed over the documents like a prize, talking about how he'd secured inside information that would ensure the project's success. It was almost sad how easily he incriminated himself. Almost. When the meeting ended, I had everything I needed. Jason's arrogance had led him straight into my hands, and Lillian's betrayal had given me the final push to finish what I'd started. I didn't wait long to act. That evening, I told Lillian we were going to dinner, her favorite restaurant, the same one we'd gone on our first anniversary. She seemed delighted, no doubt thinking this was another attempt to rekindle our romance. She dressed in the deep red dress I'd always loved on her, the one that made her look like a goddess. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, regret, maybe, or nostalgia for what we'd once had. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold certainty of what needed to be done. We were halfway through the meal when I leaned forward and smiled at her. "You know," I said casually, "I've been thinking a lot about honesty lately." She looked up from her plate, her smile faltering. "Oh," I nodded, swirling my wine glass. "It's the foundation of any good relationship, don't you think? Trust, transparency, the ability to admit when you've made a mistake." Her eyes flickered, a tell she couldn't hide. "Of course," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Why do you ask?" I set the glass down, leaning back in my chair. "Because I know about Jason." The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost comical. She froze, her fork hovering in midair, before setting it down with a clatter. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice shaky but defiant. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "I know about the affair. I know about the letter. I know about the stolen documents." I paused, savoring the way her breathing quickened. "And I know about the fake deal Jason walked into this morning." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like a woman scrambling for an escape route, but there was none. I'd sealed every door, every window, leaving her with nothing but the truth she'd been running from. When we got home, I didn't give her time to recover. I handed her a folder, thicker than the one she'd stolen, and far more damning. Inside were copies of the fake contracts, screenshots of her rifling through my desk, and a full transcript of Jason's incriminating conversation with Paul. "Here's how this is going to work," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You're going to pack your things and leave. Tomorrow, you'll sign this agreement." I tapped the folder, which states that you'll have no claim to my business, my assets, or my future. You walk away with what I decide to give you, and that's it. If you refuse, I'll take this to the police, the board of directors, and anyone else who will listen. She stared at me, her face a mask of shock and fury. "You can't do this," she whispered. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a near growl. "Watch me." As I watched her retreat to the bedroom, her steps slow and uncertain, I felt a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. I'd won, yes. I'd exposed her betrayal and ensured she couldn't hurt me or my business again. But victory tasted bitter when it came at the cost of 20 years of marriage. The morning after our confrontation, the house was unnervingly quiet. Lillian was still there, of course, silent, angry, but still there. She hadn't left yet, and that suited me just fine. I wanted her to linger in the discomfort, to sit with the reality that her game was over. I made myself coffee and sat in the kitchen, my eyes scanning the morning news on my tablet. It felt like any other day, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. I could feel her presence before I saw her. Lillian stepped into the doorway, her expression a mixture of defiance and desperation. "I didn't sign the papers," she said flatly. I didn't look up. I assumed as much. She crossed her arms, her posture stiff. "This isn't fair, Andrew. You're punishing me for betraying me? For stealing from me? For trying to ruin everything I've built." I cut her off, my voice sharp. Finally, I met her eyes, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or fear. "You made your choices, Lillian. Now you have to live with the consequences. You can't just throw me out like this," she said, her voice rising. "What will people think?" I smiled at that, slow and deliberate. "They'll think you got what you deserved." Later that day, I turned my attention to Jason. His part in this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fake deal had already begun unraveling, and I wanted to make sure he felt every bit of the impact. I sent Frank a message, instructing him to release a carefully crafted statement to Jason's firm. The email detailed Jason's supposed involvement in a fraudulent real estate deal, complete with fabricated evidence that painted him as both incompetent and unethical. It didn't take much for the rumors to spread. By mid-afternoon, I received a call from one of my contacts within the firm. "You weren't kidding about this guy," they said, their tone filled with amusement. "He's scrambling to explain himself. The board's furious." "Good," I said simply. "Keep me updated." I hung up, satisfied. Jason was on the ropes, and it wouldn't be long before his career was in tatters. It was almost too easy. Men like him, so desperate for validation, never saw the knife until it was already in their back. That evening, I returned home to find Lillian waiting for me in the living room. She'd dressed up, her makeup flawless, her hair styled in soft waves. It was the same look she used to wear when she wanted something from me, back when we were happy, or at least when I thought we were. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice calm, almost pleading. I shrugged out of my jacket and hung it on the back of a chair. "By all means." She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I know I made a mistake," she began. "I know I hurt you. But we've been married for 20 years, Andrew. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I crossed the room slowly, taking a seat across from her. "It did," I said evenly. "Until I found the letter. Until I watched you sneak around behind my back. Until you stole from me." She flinched at that, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just cheat on me, Lillian. You betrayed every ounce of trust one had in you. And now you're standing here, dressed up like nothing's changed, asking me to pretend this never happened." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm asking you to think about what we had, about the life we built together." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You didn't think about any of that when you were with him, did you?" Her silence was all the answer I needed. The next day, I put the final piece of my plan into motion. I called a meeting in my company, inviting the senior staff, board members, and a few key partners. It wasn't unusual for me to call meetings like this, but this one had a very specific purpose. When everyone was seated, I began. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. There's an important matter I need to address." I turned to the projector and displayed the evidence I'd gathered. The stolen documents, Jason's recorded conversation, and the email chain implicating him in fraudulent activity. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as the story unfolded. "As you can see," I said, my voice steady, "Jason targeted our company with the help of someone I trusted. Someone who I believed had my best interests at heart." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. Then I dropped the final bombshell. My wife, Lillian Carter, was complicit in this betrayal. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Lillian, who sat at the back of the room, pale and trembling. I'd insisted she attend, telling her it was a routine meeting about company finances. She hadn't seen this coming. "I wanted you all to know the truth," I continued. "Our company has survived worse, and it will survive this. But trust is the foundation of any business, and I refuse to let anyone, no matter who they are, compromise that." When the meeting ended, I watched as Lillian bolted from the room, her face flushed with humiliation. The staff whispered as they filed out, their eyes darting between her and me. I felt no remorse. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. That night, Lillian finally signed the papers. She didn't say a word as she handed them to me, her hands shaking. I didn't gloat or offer any parting words. I simply nodded, took the folder, and walked away. As I watched her pack her things and leave the house for the last time, I felt an unexpected wave of relief. The anger, the betrayal, it was still there, but it no longer consumed me. She was gone, and with her went the weight of 20 years of lies and deceit. I stood at the window, watching as her car disappeared down the driveway. Then I turned, poured myself a glass of scotch, and sat down in my office. The game was over. I'd won. The morning after Lillian left, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. It wasn't the kind of empty that comes with loneliness. It was the kind that comes with clarity, a quietness that felt like a reset. Her perfume no longer lingered in the air. Her things were gone from the bathroom counter, and her seat at the dining table sat untouched. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked out onto the patio, the cool morning breeze brushing against my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of pretending. No more shared silences that stretched too long. No more sidelong glances at her phone. No more questioning what was real in our marriage. It was done. I sat there for a long time, thinking about the woman I'd married and the woman she had become. In the beginning, Lillian had been a partner in every sense of the word, supportive, driven, and fiercely loyal. Or so I'd thought. Somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Maybe it was the long hours I spent at work, building the company that was supposed to be our legacy. Maybe it was the distance that crept in as success demanded more of me. Or maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. It didn't really matter now. What mattered was that I'd rebuilt my life just as I'd rebuilt my company years ago, after my father's missteps nearly brought it to ruin. Lillian had tried to tear me down, just like those years of bad investments and lawsuits. And just like then, I'd come out stronger. Jason, meanwhile, was sinking fast. News of his involvement in the fake deal spread through the real estate community like wildfire. I'd made sure of it. His firm dropped him within days, and his reputation was in tatters. A few well-placed calls ensured that his name would be blacklisted from every major development project in the city. Men like Jason didn't survive without their image, and I'd made sure his was irreparably tarnished. I wasn't done yet, though. I wanted him to feel the consequences of his arrogance, to understand the full scope of his mistake. So, I arranged for one last message to be delivered to him. A package containing a copy of the fraudulent contracts he'd signed, along with a simple note. You played the wrong game with the wrong man. I imagined the look on his face when he opened it, the dawning realization that he'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure he never forgot who had the upper hand. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work. Carter Construction was thriving, and with Lillian and Jason out of the picture, I felt a renewed sense of focus. For the first time in years, I wasn't distracted by doubts or betrayals. The company was mine, the future was mine, and I was determined to protect both at all costs. The staff who'd been at the meeting where I exposed Lillian were discreet but loyal. They respected me more for handling the situation directly, for showing that I wasn't afraid to confront betrayal even when it came from someone close. The message was clear. I was in control, and I wouldn't tolerate disloyalty, not from anyone. At home, the quietness that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. I didn't miss the tension, the lies, or the constant second-guessing. But I did miss the idea of what Lillian and I had once shared. The partnership, the laughter, the moments that felt real. Losing that had left a mark, one I wasn't sure would ever fully fade. I started spending more time in the garden, something I hadn't done in years. There was something satisfying about planting seeds, nurturing them, and watching them grow. It reminded me that life moves forward, no matter how much rubble you leave behind. One evening, as I was sitting in my office with a glass of scotch, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Frank. Everything's settled. Jason's finished, and Lillian won't dare make a move against you. Thought you'd like to know. I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it. I didn't need the reminder. I already knew I'd won. But victory wasn't just about defeating them. It was about rebuilding myself, piece by piece, into someone stronger, smarter, and untouchable. Looking back, I realized that betrayal is like a crack in the foundation. It starts small, barely noticeable, but if you ignore it, it grows. It spreads until the whole structure is at risk of collapse. But if you catch it early, if you address it with precision and determination, you can stop the damage and rebuild stronger than before. That's what I'd done. I'd caught the crack, confronted it, and rebuilt. And now, standing on the other side of it all, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't make the same mistake again. The foundation was mine to protect, and I'd guard it with everything I had. Freedom feels different when you've earned it. That was the thought that struck me as I walked into the office that Monday morning. The weight of the last few months finally lifted. The chaos Lillian and Jason had tried to create was behind me now, their betrayal reduced to a cautionary tale in my life story. What lay ahead was entirely mine to shape. The staff greeted me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They'd seen me weather a storm that would have shattered lesser men, and I could feel their renewed confidence in me. I took my seat at the head of the table during the morning meeting, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm, focused. I wasn't distracted by doubt or distrust. It was just me and the work, and it felt good. The house, now devoid of Lillian's presence, was eerily silent in the evenings. At first, I thought it might bother me, but I found a strange comfort in it. The quiet wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. I'd fill it with music sometimes, classic jazz or soft piano, and let the sound drift through the rooms. I started spending more time in my study, reading books I hadn't touched in years or sketching out ideas for new projects. One evening, I found myself flipping through old photo albums. There were pictures of Lillian and me from our early years back when everything felt fresh and full of promise. I studied our smiles, the way we held each other, and wondered if it had ever been real. Maybe it had. Maybe it hadn't. Either way, those moments were gone, and I wasn't going to waste any more time chasing them. With the drama behind me, I started focusing on myself again, not just as a businessman, but as a person. I took up running in the mornings, enjoying the crisp air and the rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement. It cleared my mind, gave me space to think without the weight of everything that had happened. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd unintentionally drifted away from during the later years of my marriage. One night, I met up with Robert, a college buddy who'd been by my side during some of the hardest times in my life. "You look good," he said as we clinked glasses over dinner. "Better than you did the last time I saw you." I laughed. That's what happens when you get rid of dead weight. He raised an eyebrow, clearly curious, but I didn't elaborate. I wasn't ready to share the full story. Not yet. But it felt good to be out, to reconnect with the world beyond the walls of my office and my home. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. I was at a charity gala, one of those events I used to attend with Lillian by my side. This time, I went alone, more out of obligation than genuine interest. I spent most of the evening making small talk with potential clients and donors, doing my part to keep up appearances. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the bar, laughing with a small group of people. Her hair was dark and fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her smile was the kind that made you want to keep looking. She wasn't flashy or overly polished, just real. There was a confidence about her that drew me in. For a moment, I hesitated. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I was ready to start anything new. But something about her made me take the chance. I walked over, introduced myself, and offered to buy her a drink. Her name was Claire, and she worked as a project manager for a nonprofit that built affordable housing. We spent the rest of the evening talking about work, life, and the things that mattered to us. There was no pretense, no games, just a genuine connection. When the night ended, I walked her to her car and asked if I could call her sometime. She smiled, handed me her card, and said, "I'd like that." Meeting Claire was a reminder that life moves forward, whether you're ready for it or not. It wasn't about replacing Lillian or trying to fill the void she left behind. It was about rediscovering what it meant to connect with someone, to share pieces of yourself without fear of betrayal. But even as I moved forward, I made a point to keep my guard up. Betrayal has a way of leaving scars, and I wasn't naive enough to think I could forget everything I'd been through. Still, I was willing to try, willing to let myself feel something again, even if it was just the tentative beginnings of trust. One night, as I stood on the balcony of my home, looking out over the city skyline I'd helped build, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. Not just for the buildings, but for the life I'd reclaimed. I'd faced betrayal and come out stronger. I'd rebuilt myself, piece by piece, and I wasn't done yet. Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, it doesn't just mend overnight. I'd learned that the hard way, and even now, with Lillian gone and the betrayal behind me, I still felt its weight. It wasn't just about her or Jason. It was about what they'd taken from me. The belief that I could share my life with someone without wondering when the next crack in the foundation might appear. But Claire was different. That much I could see from the start. Our first official date wasn't elaborate. Claire suggested a quiet dinner at a small Italian restaurant she loved, the kind of place tucked into a corner of the city that most people didn't know existed. It wasn't flashy or overdone, just good food, good wine, and a quiet atmosphere where we could talk. She asked me about my work, her questions thoughtful and genuinely curious. Most people only cared about the big numbers, the skyscrapers, and the profit margins, but Claire wanted to know about the why. Why I'd chosen construction, why I cared so much about building things that lasted. "It's about legacy," I told her, sipping my wine. When you build something, really build it, it's not just for today. It's for the people who come after. I like knowing that what I've created will outlive me. She smiled at that, a slow, thoughtful smile that made me feel like she truly understood. That's why I love what I do, she said. Building affordable housing isn't glamorous, but it's meaningful. It changes lives. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt a spark of connection that wasn't tied to obligation or pretense. With Claire, everything felt easy, natural. There were no games, no hidden motives, just two people sharing a moment. Still, I couldn't deny the small voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered warnings every time I started to feel comfortable. I'd trusted before, and it had cost me. What if Claire wasn't who she seemed? What if history repeated itself? That doubt lingered, subtle but persistent, like a crack in a wall that hadn't yet spread. I knew it wasn't fair to her. Claire hadn't given me any reason to question her intentions. But the scars from Lillian's betrayal weren't going to fade overnight. I needed to find a way to balance caution with openness, to protect myself without shutting Claire out. As weeks turned into months, Claire and I spent more time together. We didn't rush things, and I appreciated that about her. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed grand gestures or constant attention. She was steady, patient, and thoughtful in a way that reminded me of the kind of partnership I'd always wanted. One night, as we walked along the waterfront after dinner, she turned to me and asked, "What happened to your marriage?" The question caught me off guard, but her tone wasn't prying. It was careful, almost hesitant, as if she didn't want to push too hard. I looked out over the water, the reflections of city lights shimmering on the surface. "She betrayed me," I said finally. "With someone younger, someone who thought he could take what I'd built." Claire didn't say anything right away, just slipped her arm through mine and walked beside me in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded explanation. It was the kind that told me she understood, that she wasn't going to press for more than I was ready to give. When I glanced at her, she met my eyes and said softly, "That must have been hard." It was such a simple statement, but it carried weight. She wasn't offering empty sympathy or trying to fix anything. She was just acknowledging the truth of it, and that was enough. With Claire, I began to see that trust wasn't something you gave all at once. It was something you built piece by piece, moment by moment. It was in the way she listened without judgment, the way she never pushed for more than I was ready to share. It was in her honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable about her own struggles and fears. One evening, as we sat on her porch drinking coffee, she told me about her own heartbreak, a long-term relationship that had ended when her partner decided he didn't want the same thing she did. She didn't dwell on the details, didn't play the victim. She just shared it, openly and honestly, as if to say, "I understand what it feels like to lose something you thought would last." Her honesty made me want to share more of myself, to let her see the parts of me I'd been holding back. It wasn't easy. I'd spent so long building walls that tearing them down felt unnatural. But with Claire, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like a choice. The more time I spent with Claire, the more I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant learning from it, finding a balance between caution and openness, between protecting myself and letting someone in. It wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about building a life that acknowledged them without letting them define me. Claire never asked for more than I was ready to give, and that made all the difference. She wasn't Lillian. She wasn't trying to take anything from me. She was just there, steady and patient, offering something I hadn't felt in a long time: partnership. One night, as I walked her to her car after dinner, she turned to me and smiled. "You know, you're different than I expected." "How so?" I asked, curious. She tilted her head, studying me. "Most men with your kind of success seem guarded, like they're always playing a game. But you're not like that." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You have no idea how wrong you are." She smiled softly, her eyes warm. "Maybe, or maybe you just don't see yourself the way I do." Her words stayed with me long after she drove away. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was more than the scars Lillian and Jason had left behind. Maybe I was still the man who believed in building things that lasted, who believed in legacy and trust and connection. The day I finally felt free was a day like any other, quiet, unassuming, and ordinary in every way that mattered. I'd just come back from a site visit, my boots still caked with dirt, and my shirt streaked with sweat. There was something satisfying about being on the ground, seeing the progress firsthand, watching the skeleton of a building rise against the horizon. It reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. I stood there in the parking lot, the afternoon sun warming my face, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I was happy. Not just content, not just relieved to have survived the storm, but genuinely, deeply happy. For the first time in years, the weight of betrayal no longer sat on my shoulders. It was still there, in the background, like an old scar that had healed but never completely disappeared. But it no longer defined me. I was more than what had been done to me, more than the mistakes I'd made or the trust I'd lost. I was free. Claire and I had settled into an easy rhythm, one that felt as natural as breathing. We weren't rushing anything, and that suited me just fine. She was the kind of woman who didn't need grand gestures or constant reassurance. She valued substance over style, sincerity over spectacle, and that was exactly what I needed. One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "Do you ever think about where you'll be in 10 years? I thought about it for a moment, the question settling over me like a warm blanket. Not as much as I used to, I admitted. I've spent so much of my life chasing the future that I forgot to enjoy the present. I'm trying to change that." She smiled, her fingers lightly brushing against mine. "I think you're doing a pretty good job so far." Her words stayed with me long after the sun had set. For the first time, I wasn't consumed by the need to control every outcome, to anticipate every betrayal. I was learning to trust again, not just in others, but in myself. The company had grown stronger in the months since Lillian's departure. The fallout from her betrayal and Jason's scheming had left a few cracks in the foundation, but I'd repaired them quickly. My team was loyal, my projects were thriving, and my reputation remained intact. If anything, the ordeal had made me more determined than ever to protect what I'd built. But my legacy wasn't just about buildings. It was about people, my employees, my partners, the communities we served. I'd started reaching out to younger entrepreneurs, mentoring them the way I wish someone had mentored me when I was just starting out. It felt good to give back, to share the lessons I'd learned, and help others avoid the mistakes I'd made. One day, as I walked through the offices, I saw a group of interns huddled around a table, their heads bent over a set of blueprints. They were arguing about the best way to approach a design challenge, their voices filled with passion and determination. It reminded me of myself, all those years ago, when the possibilities felt endless and failure was just a stepping stone. I paused, watching them for a moment, and felt a surge of pride. This was my legacy, not the buildings, not the profits, but the people. The ones who would carry my vision forward long after I was gone. Not long after, I received an unexpected call from Lillian. Her voice was hesitant, almost timid, as if she wasn't sure how to begin. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "About us, about what I did." I didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to ask why she was calling, what she hoped to gain. But another part of me already knew. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it." I leaned back in my chair, the old anger flaring briefly before it dissolved into something quieter. I didn't hate her. Not anymore. I'd moved past that. But I also knew there was no point in rehashing the past. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But that chapter is closed for me, Lillian. I've moved on." She didn't argue, didn't try to plead her case. She simply said, "Take care, Andrew," and hung up. And just like that, the last lingering thread of our marriage unraveled. That night, I sat on the balcony of my home, a glass of scotch in hand, and looked out over the city. The skyline stretched before me, a testament to everything I'd built. Each building told a story of challenges overcome, risks taken, and dreams realized. And now, as I looked toward the future, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Claire was waiting inside, the soft glow of the living room lights casting her silhouette against the window. She turned, saw me watching, and smiled. It was a small gesture, simple and unassuming, but it carried more weight than I could put into words. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was mine, messy, complicated, and beautiful in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I finished my scotch and headed inside, I thought about the lessons I'd learned over the past year. Betrayal might leave scars, but it doesn't have to define you. Trust might be fragile, but it can be rebuilt. In life, no matter how many cracks appear, is always worth rebuilding. I wasn't just a builder of skyscrapers. I was a builder of legacies. And this time, I was building one that would last.